wow, one person show is terrible. That said, I can now go into presenting Dr. Emily Gonzales and then leave her the room to talk more about deers. So, oh, Judith said that she's so impressed with your picture, Emily. I was so focused on making this right that I didn't notice, and I was like, whoa, that's impressive. Yes. So more seriously, Dr. Emily Gonzales is the Ecological Restoration Specialist with Parks Canada, where she coordinates, develops programs, develops policies, and provides scientific and strategic planning advice for ecological restoration projects in national protected areas. She is an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria, where she teaches a suite of different restoration courses. She has expertise in impact of deer grazing and browsing on native vegetation, particularly in the meadows, in forests, and in dunes found in southwestern BC and in the southern Gulf Island. Today, Emily is here with us to really talk about ungulates effects on native vegetation species in the southern Gulf Island, where she did her PhD in, if I'm not wrong. So please, Emily, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Please go ahead and have your chat open because this is going to be a bit of an interactive talk. And I'm going to have questions for you. You can have questions for me at the end, so it's only fair if I ask you questions throughout. So as you probably know, our mandate here in Parks Canada is to restore ecological integrity. And my team does that by providing financial, technical, and sometimes emotional support to park staff who are tackling those really complex conservation issues. And given that we have 48 parks, as well as marine protected areas and hundreds of national historic sites and a finite amount of money, it can be a real balancing act. See what I did there with the photo, balancing act? That is, we have to make tough but strategic decisions around effective and efficient restoration actions. And there we go. So today I'm going to talk about three things. One, my job is rad. Two, around squirrels. You saw that squirrel scapegoats on the outline. And then I'll get to the main feature of deer and invasive plants in the Gulf Islands. So when I say my job is rad, I do mean it's excellent, but it's actually about the strategic thinking that's needed when we consider restoration. That is, given we have this finite amount of money, and invasive species, that is species from outside their range that are capable of causing significant harm to our environment, economy, or society, the management of those species could consume our entire budget in Parks Canada, and then some. And so we actually have to be quite strategic around which of those species are we going to focus eradication whenever feasible. So that's the resist component. That is when we work to restore an ecosystem to what it was like before that species intervened. But we can't always do that. So there are times when we might direct what's happening. That might mean mitigating the effects of that invasive species, controlling it. Or there are going to be times when we accept that that species is now a part of the ecosystem. So in my current job with Parks Canada, I've been working with parks from coast to coast who have an issue with hyperabundant species. And one of those hyperabundant species are moose in Newfoundland, a species that was introduced. So you could say it was non-native, and it is, but not we, but the people of Newfoundland have determined it's a naturalized species, that it's a desirable species, it's part of the boreal ecosystem, it just happened to not get over to the big island of Newfoundland, but there's a desire to keep it there. So that's an example of when we chose to accept that this is a species that's going to be a part of the national park and its ecological integrity, as long as it doesn't get too abundant. So that's what I do now. But today we're going to go back in time. 25 years ago, I began my graduate research, and I was always very interested in non-native species. I mean, they're kind of amazing. Here they are, they come from another place. They don't know, they don't have any friends. They don't know anybody. It's a brand new habitat. And most of the time they fail. That is the vast majority of the situation when a new species is introduced. But every once in a while they do really well, and sometimes they do really, really, really well. And I think that's kind of fascinating. Although I admit 25 years ago, I just thought they were evil. All invasive species were evil. Anything that came into our ecosystem and messed it up, that needed to be fixed. And so both my master's and PhD focused on the effects of invasive species as well as what happened to those species themselves. And so we'll start with squirrels today because that master's research really shifted my thinking around non-native species. So I'd like to share that with you. So the two mysteries, while I was a graduate student, I called myself an ecological detective because something happened. The Douglas squirrels had disappeared. The native flowers in Garry Oak Meadows were disappearing. So my job was to try to figure out what happened to them. So let me introduce you to the players. So for my master's, this is a Douglas squirrel. It's a native squirrel on the west coast of North America. And the native squirrel found in Vancouver. Very cute. And this is an eastern gray squirrel. It was introduced to various parts of the world, including the west side of North America, but it's native to central and eastern North America, such as Ontario, New York, and other regions around there. And despite their name, they can be black, blonde, reddish, whitish, and all kinds of mixtures of colors. Also very cute, yes? Here's the first interactive part. So, some people consider eastern gray squirrels an invader. They are non-native and fuzzy-tailed evil rats. And so I'm curious where you land. What's your opinion? Don't worry, there's no wrong answer here. I'm just curious. And so do you fall on the side of squirrels being evil, or are squirrels cute? Please go ahead and put it in the chat. Where do you stand right now on the squirrel question? So I'm going to pause until I can see. Oh, nice. Oh, interesting. Okay. Nice. This is great. Okay, thank you. So there'll be more questions like this, and not sure is always a good answer. I love Kent's here, sometimes lunch. I'm gonna take a tangent here. So part of my master's was to also collect samples from road-killed squirrels or otherwise demised squirrels. So I was doing some genetic analyses, and there's someone in Vancouver Island who was willing to share her bits of squirrel as long as I didn't take too much, because she loved to put them into curry. So they are eaten widely in the Carolinas, in the eastern part of North America, so it's not uncommon. All right, that was an aside. We're going to come back to Vancouver, and we're going to go back to 1909. So this image, this is a painting in 1909, which is about the time that the first eastern gray squirrels were introduced to Western North America. 6 to 8 squirrels were brought over by train, a gift from the New York Parks Department to Stanley Park. And this was a really thoughtful gift. You know, you can imagine trying to keep squirrels alive on a train. That must have been a little chaotic all the way across the country. And then when they were introduced here, people love to make a family outing to come and feed the squirrels. And it's actually probably good for the squirrels that they did, because Vancouver at that time, that's not the slide I wanted. That's the slide I wanted. Vancouver at the time looked mostly like this. This is a picture of Granville Street. If anyone knows Vancouver, this is Granville and 37th. So there was a lot of conifer forests, and probably not a lot of eastern gray squirrel food. So thanks to the people in Stanley Park, they had a nice rich food source. And over the years, eventually, they started to really flourish. Now, we don't have a lot of data around the numbers of squirrels or their distributions. This is based on wildlife shelter submissions. And so what you're seeing here is about 20 years of wildlife rescue. That is, when people found injured squirrels, they bring them to the wildlife shelter, who would rehabilitate them and release them. So this is all we've got. This is all we know about squirrel distribution. So we're making some inferences. But what it suggests is that squirrel numbers, or at least the ones brought into wildlife shelters, increased quite a lot over the 90s into the 2000s, maybe stabilizing a bit there at the end. And then on the bottom, those red bars are the native squirrels. Flying squirrels, I'm not going to talk about. They are also native to this region. There aren't very many of them. But Douglas squirrels, there were enough for us to be able to do this analysis. And we do see an increase in the 90s in both the native squirrels and then some decline. Now, we don't know what is going on. I have no idea what the mechanisms are here, but certainly it would be a logical assumption that as eastern gray squirrels increased, they were having some negative impact on the native squirrels. So that was my question. But there are two questions here, really. So that first one is the competitive exclusion question. Are invasive eastern gray squirrels replacing native Douglas squirrels? But what was happening, of course, simultaneously throughout Metro Vancouver is a change in the habitat type. So all those forests were being cut down and suburbanized. And so that habitat that both squirrels were surviving in was also changing. And so the other question is that habitat shift favoring that introduced squirrel more so than the native squirrel? So a tale of two squirrels. So here's another way to look at those data from the wildlife shelters. And so here we are looking at it spatially. And I've indicated where those wildlife shelters are, just out of interest. I was gathering that information from Critter Care, Monica's Wildlife Shelter, as well as the Burnaby Wildlife Rescue. The circles, or the size of the circles, represents how many records they had in total from those areas. So that big circle is 500 or more, and then down to 1 to 50 for the little circles. And again, we have our three species, and again, focusing just on the clear circle of Douglas squirrels and then the black filled-in circle of gray squirrels. What we see is a lot of squirrels in that immediate area around Stanley Park, indicated by the cross. So that's where they were first introduced. I also surveyed pest management companies to find out when they would get calls around dealing with squirrels, as well as put out a public survey to try to get a sense of how squirrels spread. And what I learned from those is in the 1970s, eastern gray squirrels started showing up in North and West Vancouver, up to the north of the map, as well as in Kitsilano to the west. And then through time, over the course of about 20 years, they made their way east all the way to Chilliwack. And that's very interesting because up until the 70s, excuse me, they stayed pretty confined to Stanley Park. There's very few records before then of squirrels being very abundant outside of Stanley Park. So it took a while for them to spread. But there's something else I'd like you to notice about this. This is when my ideas really started shifting. In every single municipality, all 13, both squirrels continue to coexist. Now that's interesting because in Stanley Park as well, where they have been together for over 100 years, if that competitive exclusion hypothesis was the winner, you would have thought maybe that Douglas squirrels would have declined by now. But there's a very healthy population of Douglas squirrels there. There's also a very healthy forest there. Now, even though I did my studies in the West Coast, my supervisor was at the University of Guelph. And so off I went in the 90s to live in Ontario for the first time, and I arrived at the University of Guelph, and there are squirrels everywhere there. Now, eastern gray squirrels are native to Ontario, so that's not surprising. But maybe what was a bit surprising to me was that North American red squirrels were also quite abundant there. So this is the squirrel that is also found on Vancouver Island. It's a cousin to Douglas squirrels. They're very similar. And those two species, eastern gray squirrels and red squirrels, have coexisted for thousands and thousands of years in the eastern part of North America. So how is that happening? A study in the 1990s suggests that it's about segregating their habitat. While they can overlap, and they do overlap, especially when resources are high, they manage to persist largely because we mostly find the red squirrels in more rural areas and eastern gray squirrels in their now natural habitat of university campuses, residential areas, places that have these beautiful big deciduous trees with lots of nuts in people's gardens where they thrive. And what was an additionally interesting thing for me to learn about was Indiana, where red squirrels were the new squirrel. So here was a place where gray squirrels were the native dominant squirrel, and then some landscape change started shifting the distribution of red squirrels. And as they increased, people in that state got really concerned because eastern gray squirrels are the good guys there. They collect all the acorns, the hazelnuts, they bury them, and that's what promotes tree recruitment. However, red squirrels create these middens. You've probably seen them, big piles, and trees don't tend to recruit very well in those middens. And so Jake Goheen and his colleagues were very concerned that we were going to lose a bunch of nut trees because of this shift in squirrel distribution. So I guess my point is, depending on where you're at and who your first squirrel is, that's going to influence your perception on the impact that squirrels are having. And as I was looking for images for this talk, I was quite surprised to see that Sarah Dubois has done an article about my papers in this work. If you'd like to read it, I suggest reading that and not my papers. And she was the speaker last week, so small world. And her article is called "Gray Squirrels, Invasive Species or Scapegoat." And what I would say is that the body of evidence seems to suggest that habitat is the main determinant of squirrel population and distribution. And so while we might like to point to the thing that's so visible, these gray squirrels, which we definitely see increasing in number and spreading as being the bad guy affecting native squirrels, there could be other factors. So I'm not saying that gray squirrels aren't evil. They could very well be. But I think we have to consider more than just they're showing up and beating up little red squirrels. And what I can say is, having worked in Stanley Park for 5 years as a naturalist, the interaction you see between the two squirrels is the Douglas squirrel kicking eastern gray squirrel butt. And that's because they tend to be a more aggressive squirrel. They have territories they defend much more strongly, whereas gray squirrels are a bit more laid back. So I'll leave that, but it certainly ended up shifting my perception around how I was going to view species in a landscape. So the next landscape I worked in was this one, and I'd love to come back to you and find out if you know where this is. Take some guesses, folks who live in the islands. So while I'm waiting to see your guesses, this is shifting over to the second mystery I wanted to solve around the disappearing flowers in Garry Oak Meadows. And what you're seeing in this image is predominantly a non-native annual grass, a lot of it, or a couple non-native annual grasses. More than 90% of the vegetation, the non-tree vegetation in this landscape, are alien grasses. Oh, and Steve Michelle wins. Do we have a prize? This is Saturna. That's right. Beautiful. One of the best places to sit and do a PhD, I can tell you. So I spent a lot of my time traveling throughout the San Juan and Gulf Islands doing plant studies in these meadows. I'm curious if anyone knows anything else about Saturna. What else might live here? Judith knows, yes. So here's a close-up of the grass that you mostly see in this image. This is called Hedgehog Dog Tail, and you can see it's quite bristly. And I think the reason for that is because the main herbivore in this site are these guys. So there's a feral population of goats, and they're good eaters. And so one of the only plants that's been able to persist are well-defended armored plants like Hedgehog Dog Tail and another one called ripgut brome. You can imagine what that might be like to eat. So this made me curious. What role, if any, might herbivores like goats and sheep and deer play in driving plant community composition in meadows like these? You know, is it just that these invasive plants are evil and really effective at pushing out native plants? Or is there something else going on? Are there other factors, habitat changes that could be happening here? So I've simplified my thesis research questions to these three. What do deer like to eat? Because if they preferentially eat native plants and avoid non-native plants, maybe that could help explain a shift. 2, what is limiting native plants and seeds in these Garry Oak meadows? Is it competition by other plants, or is it herbivory? And then finally, based on that, what might help native plants do better? Should we be fencing and protecting them from herbivory, or should we be mowing, or maybe both? And so I began this work. Here's my first field assistant, Jerry, carrying our quadrat around, zipping around in the Zodiac to these multiple sites. So as I said, about 340 plots through 40 island sites. And the reason to use the islands is because they served as a natural experiment. So there were islands of different sizes, different isolations, different numbers of herbivores, different types of herbivores. So that's a piece I need to make clear. Some of these islands had sheep, some had deer, some had goats, some had fallow deer versus black-tailed deer, but not very many. The vast majority of islands, if they had a herbivore at all, it was black-tailed deer, the native deer. And then there were a couple of islands that had others. So in all of the work I'm going to talk about, of course, that's going to be influencing the results, the fact that there are other herbivores on some of these island sites. Okay, so that first question was, what do deer like to eat? Or what do herbivores like to eat? But most of my sites had black-tailed deer. And the way I looked at this was to do all of those 340 plots and note every time a particular species was bitten. I couldn't always tell by what, but there are some patterns we can talk about if you're really interested. And then I took that 100+ species list and simplified it into these 7 categories. So these categories on the left side are the native plants, native annual forbs, things like sea blush or monkey flower, native perennial forbs like camas, native perennial grasses like Alaskan onion grass. And then over on the non-native side, we have non-native annual forbs, non-native perennial forbs, non-native annual grasses, non-native perennial grasses. And you'll see there's 4 categories on that side, because over on the native side, there's actually no native annual grasses, which is kind of interesting. Now, that site on Saturna, mostly non-native annual grass. And there are really no native annual grasses in that Garry Oak ecosystem. So that's a really big shift. Something's really influenced that. Okay, so this is a very simple, what's called a forage index. So based on the availability of these different species within each of those 7 classes, I asked, were they being eaten more than you might expect by chance or less so? So more so is going to be green here, and that suggests that they were the favorite, versus avoided, which are in the red. And so since you see more red over on the non-native species side, that suggests that the herbivores, mostly black-tailed deer, were avoiding the non-native plants and preferentially choosing the native plants. And this just quantitatively demonstrates what we all have probably seen and know is that, yeah, if there's camas, arbutus, those deer are gunning it for those species. They're very tasty, very much appreciated, but not all. As you can see, there's some red over on that side. Some species are avoided. Okay. Then I also did some experiments because, you know, that was just a natural experiment. That could have been coincidental. I'm not really testing a mechanism there. So here's the experiment. This is called a 2x2 factorial because there were 2 treatments and 2 factors in each. I was interested in the effect of competition by other plants on native plants that I would plant. So that's the experimental part. I controlled all that. And the effects of herbivory. So most of this work was done on Gabriola, Saturna, and Salt Spring. And this is Salt Spring in this image. And what you're seeing is a S minus H minus plot. So Brandy with the red hair, she is removing all the vegetation, even the native vegetation, because we really wanted to do the test of competition as strongly as we could. How much does other competition or plants influence the native plants we're going to plant? And we even like spaded around the plant to break tillers up. And then in the back there is Peter Arcis and some other helpers making the fence. Peter was my supervisor to protect this plot from herbivory as well. And so each time we crossed, so we had 4 treatments with the competition and without, with a fence or without. So to put in other terms, I was curious what ecological process wins. So one ecological process is herbivory, I eat you, versus competition, I'm a terrible roommate and my terrible roommate habits are going to make you want to leave. So let's take a look. We're coming up to another participation, so get ready. So I had 3 experiments. In the first one, we had those 4 treatments, and I planted in each one of those plots established plants. So plants I had grown and nurtured till they were a couple years old or bought from a nursery and put them in the ground in those 4 treatments with fences or cleared. In the second one, I just sprinkled seeds, just like it would be in the natural environment. And the third one, I was asking which of those restoration methods, fencing or mowing or both, would be better to improve the condition of native plants. And so again, just curious what you think right now, what would be your best guess? So in that first one, so the scenario is I've got these 4 types of plots, I'm planting them. Which is the stronger ecological influence, herbivory or competition on plants I've planted in the ground, plants that are a couple years old? Wild guess. Eat. Like that. Yes, in case you need to be reminded, these are the 2 treatments. I eat you or I'm a terrible roommate. So for this first one, you know, I'm planting plants, and so that means I'm digging a hole and planting an established plant that already has some resources. So it's possible, we might guess, that herbivory would be the more negative impact than competition, because you've got a plant that's already got some resources, and it might even look quite delicious and appealing to a herbivore. That's what I would have probably guessed. But the second one is more interesting. So we've got seeds now. So seeds I'm just sprinkling onto the ground. And again, do you think it's going to be herbivory or competition that's going to limit those seeds? What's going to make it harder for those seeds to turn into, you know, plants. That makes sense. And then in terms of treatments, if you were going to go out there and try to make this Garry Oak Meadow all better again, would you fence, would you mow, or would you do both? Okay. Yeah. All right, let's find out what happened in my experiment. So for experiment 1, so the way to be reading these is the triangles. Those are cases where there was a fence around the plot. And then the circles are the competition situation. And actually, it's not like that. It's the red circle means that there's still plants on the ground, that the competition is there in maybe impacting the plants. The red circle, and then the third one down as well, the triangle with the green. And these are 3 of the 5 species that I planted of established plants. So really the clearest result to see here is in the bottom left with sea blush. And here's how to read this. So over the course of the 3 years of the experiment, the plants that were in a fence took off. More and more, like, so look at the y-axis, hundreds of sea blush showed up if there was a fence around them. However, if there was no fence, in many of those sites, they were actually extirpated, wiped out completely. And there is no effect of the shading. Whether or not there were plants on the ground did not have a significant impact. Now you'll see that in all these cases, the dark green triangles were the best condition. That is when there was both a fence and all the plants removed. But what I'm saying is it wasn't statistically significant in any of those plants. What was significant is that herbivory wins for the established plants, which many of you guessed exactly that is what happened. Okay, but then what about the seed situation? So here I had 7 different seed species. Only 3 of them had measurable results, so this was a little less clear. But where it was clear, herbivory won again, which surprises me, actually. So the fenced plots over the course of the 4 years were the ones that did the best. And again, there was actually no effect of competition, no effect of removing the plants, or at least no measurable effect. So in this case, herbivory won again. Okay, so here's the final experiment. Now this one was a bit different, so I'm not planting plants. In fact, I was taking away plants. What I did is I had these fences and cleared areas. You know, I was repeatedly mowing them over the course of those 4 years. And then at the end of that, I collected all the vegetation in each of the plots, identified it, weighed it, and estimated biomass. So what was the most biomass after all of that in each of the different categories? So I'm just going to show you the high-level summary of native versus non-native species here. And if you look at the treatment, so it was either cutting or mowing, the one that most of you guessed that both of them would be the best treatment is the C+, F+, the third one through, and you're looking at the red dot. So see that red dot is higher than the other 3 red dots there. That's because that was the best situation for native species. So you were right, mowing and fencing was the best scenario. But wait, there's more. If you look to the left, you'll see a big green line and dot. That's the non-native species. And that treatment is when there's a fence, but no clearing. So there was no removal, no mowing over the course of those 4 years. And so not actually surprisingly, once you reflect on it, when we protected the site from herbivory, there was a big response in vegetation, but it was particularly the non-native grasses in this case, non-native perennial grasses that flourished. So that's something to keep in mind, that even though herbivory had the stronger effect than competition in my other two experiments, in this case, it was both ecological processes influencing native species. And if we come back to that same graph, so this is coming back again to what do deer like to eat? Take a look at non-native perennial grasses right at the end of this figure. There's a bunch of green there in the non-native section. So that's suggesting that black-tailed deer were enjoying some amount of non-native perennial grasses, which also isn't that surprising because these are often grasses that are used in feeding of herbivores like cattle. So they have some level of palatability. So what does all of this mean? I began this talk trying to solve this mystery of where have all the flowers gone? And could the transition from native to non-native grasses in Garry Oak Meadows been facilitated by deer? And the answer to that is yeah. yes, it could have. Because deer do like to preferentially eat native species, disproportionately so to non-native species. That being said, they do also enjoy non-native perennial grasses and do serve some moderating effect on those grasses. So on Salt Spring Island, where there was a big fence put up, there were some recovery of native plants, but there was also a big flush of non-native perennial grasses, not annual grasses, perennial grasses like orchard grass. What limits native species in that experiment definitely was herbivory, but competition has a role as well. And that's what we found in the experiment where we were removing all the plants, that both fencing and mowing were beneficial to natives. Of all the different treatments, pairing those two up had the best response for native plants. However, it really helps to add native species as well, because many of these sites have been so degraded for so long that there's a lack of native plants in there. So if we really want the best outcome, we need to add native plants back into that environment. Now, at the beginning, I did set up a bit of a false dichotomy. Both experiments tested this dichotomy, but as we've seen, it's really both of those ecological processes affecting things. Someone notes that time of year is important. You're absolutely right, Judith. So coming back to dichotomies, here's the other false dichotomy in this whole exercise of ecological restoration. So, we think about the role of humans or strange walking apes as being generally negative, a negative influence on the whole ecosystems of Earth. But that's not really how it works. In my job in Parks Canada, so after I finished my graduate work, my first job was at Thousand Islands National Park, where one of the biggest threats there were hyperabundant white-tailed deer. Thousand Islands National Park is basically the Gulf Islands of Ontario. And we began working with Mohawks of Akwesasne to reintroduce predation back onto the landscape, because here was the problem. There was hunting going on around the park, but within the national park, there was no hunting, and the natural predators were extirpated over 100 years ago. And so we had islands with hyperabundant deer and no natural predation. So to reintroduce that natural process, we worked with Mohawks of Akwesasne and continue to do so. And that population has been reduced, and there's some recovery happening now. So that's an example of a resist ecological restoration strategy, working to restore that missing ecosystem process of predation. Now this photo is, if you see what I'm holding very delicately in my hands, is a green crab. So green crabs invaded Kedjimekujik. This is in Nova Scotia. And for the last 10 plus years, there's been an active program that has removed millions of crabs now. And there's been some recovery of eelgrass. But this is a tricky one. So there was 1 year where they stepped back, and it didn't take much for the crabs to come back and decimate the gains that had been made. And so what do? It's kind of unsustainable to continue to just go out there and try to catch crabs. How long do we do that for? So now this project has shifted gears. Instead of just thinking about crabs as this enemy that needs to be removed, they're working with researchers to see if there's a different relationship we can have with this new species, perhaps through food. So there is a food truck who has been playing around with making crab burgers. And then there's a whole other line of researchers interested in bioplastics. And so this has been some experimenting on whether the chitin of the shells could be translated into a plastic that would biodegrade. And so this is where we're just shifting how we're relating to an invasive species. Because if we only think about it as something we have to kill and remove, that's probably got a limited life that we can do that for. And then finally, this is me up to my armpits in garlic mustard on Middle Island. Middle Island is part of Point Pelee National Park. It's the most southern part of Canada, and the vegetation here is amazing. Maybe not this particular patch. And this is an example of accept. At this point, there's nothing we're doing about all of this garlic mustard because we prioritize management of cormorants. So cormorants have nested on the island and were killing the trees, and that was having a much more devastating impact on the species at risk and rare Carolinian plant species than the garlic mustard. And so in this case, there's some acceptance and there's also some direction, and it's just not a simple answer, right? But we're prioritizing and being strategic about what we can do for the most ecological integrity benefits. So with our last steering committee, Stephanie said some words that really resonated with me, and that was complex conservation problems can only be solved collaboratively. And so, you know, when I started my research, the world was a simpler place. There were good species, there were bad species, we just need to get rid of the bad species. And now my job is much more in the land of understanding our values, because we're not going to get rid of all the species, and what's good and bad is really pretty relative, and there's a lot of different perspectives. And so this is a shot taken from 2018 when we could still meet in Point Pelee National Park, where we collaboratively developed a restoration plan with Caldwell and Walpole First Nations, the province, NGOs, researchers, and this is really how we're going to manage invasive species moving forward in a collaborative way that involves us people. So what does all of this mean? What are the implications for Sidney Island? Well, no surprise. We come back to the PhD, going to deal with the herbivores first, and there's substantial vegetation restoration that'll be required as well. But there's an important implication that might be a little less obvious. I didn't talk about this a lot, but happy to. So coming back to all those 40 island sites, the sites that had fallow deer, goats, or sheep, they really skewed some of the impact or interpretations around the effect that herbivory had. Very few islands had those species. Most of those islands just had black-tailed deer or no deer at all. Hyperabundant black-tailed deer can have a really dramatic effect, and we see that on Darcy Island. But of those 40 sites, very few islands were like that. Most of the time, deer were not necessarily hyperabundant, and this is the part that I'm still fascinated by. Even when they did have high densities, the vegetation wasn't always that impacted. Lopez Island was the most notable. There's very high densities, as far as I could tell, black-tailed deer there. And it was also the most beautiful site I worked on, the most diverse, the most lush, the most species. That's in the San Juan Islands. So again, there's other factors going on, other variables going on. Have with the place, what kind of relationship do you want to have? That's what I came to share today. And let's open it up